Some stories begin with a warning. This one begins with a correction. What hunted us was not lost, not confused, and not driven by desperation. It knew exactly where we were going before we did. If you are listening to this now, understand that nothing in this story happens by accident. Subscribe before it becomes clear why no official report ever used the word Wechuge. I was part of a 6-person recovery team sent into the northern wilderness in late October. The assignment was simple: locate an abandoned survey camp and confirm whether the missing crew had moved south or died where they stopped responding. We were told to expect exposure, equipment failure, and human error. We were not told to expect patterns. The first sign was not a sound. It was behavior. People began choosing sleeping positions they could not explain. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Everyone felt watched, but not from the trees, from the space between us. By the second night, one of us refused to eat. He said he was not hungry. The rest of us were starving. That was when I understood something was wrong with the way hunger was moving through the group. We did not realize we were being separated long before anyone went missing. Like the video now. Because the moment the first person disappears is where the story changes shape. Share this if you believe the most dangerous predators do not rush. This is the story of the Wechuge that hunted us one by one, and I am telling it because the official ending is a lie. The man who went first did not scream, and that is the detail that still wakes me up years later, because screaming would have meant panic, movement, resistance, and there was none of that when he disappeared. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of person everyone trusted without ever discussing why. The kind of person who took the first watch voluntarily and insisted he would stay awake even when the rest of us argued that rotating shifts was safer, because he said the cold helped him think and silence made him alert. The last time I saw him alive, he was standing just beyond the firelight, close enough that I could see his breath, but far enough that his face was already starting to lose definition, as if the dark was slowly learning the shape of him. He raised a hand to signal that everything was fine, and I remember feeling irritated by how calm he looked, because the forest had been wrong all evening in a way I could not explain. Like the space between trees was deeper than it should have been, like the night was layered. I fell asleep thinking I could hear something moving far away, not footsteps, not branches snapping, but the steady sound of pressure, like weight being shifted carefully so nothing would break. When I woke up, the fire was still burning, which should not have been possible after that many hours, and Daniel was gone. At first, nobody panicked, because panic requires certainty, and all we had was absence. We called his name once, then again, louder each time, spreading outward in a widening circle of sound that came back unchanged, as if the forest had swallowed it without echo. His rifle was still leaning against the log where he had been sitting. His boots were still by the fire, turned neatly toward the heat like he had planned to put them back on. There were no tracks in the frost around camp except our own. Someone joked that he was playing a stupid prank, and nobody laughed, not because it was unfunny, but because none of us believed it. The air felt heavier the longer we stood there, like the morning itself was delayed, like daylight was struggling to arrive. We searched for 3 hours, spreading out in pairs, calling his name until our throats burned, circling back to camp over and over as if pulled by something we did not want to name. There was no blood. There were no torn branches. There was nothing that suggested a struggle, which was worse than finding evidence, because it meant whatever had taken him did not need to fight. By noon, hunger started to claw at us in a way that felt sudden and aggressive, like it had been waiting for permission to surface. Food tasted wrong, metallic and thin, and nobody finished their portion except Mark, who ate silently and quickly, avoiding eye contact, his hands shaking as if he had not eaten in days. That was when the idea surfaced quietly, without anyone speaking it, that Daniel had not wandered off, that he had been selected. The second death was slower, and that is how we understood this was not random, Mark was the first to change after Daniel vanished, though at the time we called it shock, because shock is a word that makes fear manageable. He stopped shivering even when the rest of us could not stop, and he began volunteering for tasks that required distance, longer patrols, deeper checks into the tree line, always returning with the same empty expression and the same sentence, "Nothing out there, nothing at all." That night, the hunger became unbearable. Rations that should have lasted days were gone in hours, torn open and consumed with a desperation that bordered on violence. And when we confronted Mark about it, he did not apologize or deny it. He simply stared at us with an expression that looked like confusion mixed with relief, as if eating had quieted something inside him. I remember thinking that he looked healthier than the rest of us, his skin flushed, his eyes clear, while the rest of us were hollowing out. We heard the sound after midnight, not close, not far, but somewhere in between, like it was circling the edge of our hearing on purpose. It was not a growl or a howl, but a wet, rhythmic sound that suggested chewing, slow and deliberate, followed by a pause that felt intentional, as if whatever was making it wanted us to imagine what came next. Mark stood up before anyone could stop him. He said he was hungry again. I watched him walk into the darkness without his rifle, without his coat fully zipped, moving with a confidence that terrified me more than panic would have. None of us followed him, and that is something we never admitted out loud, because in that moment we understood that following meant offering ourselves willingly. The sound stopped. Silence rushed back, and so quickly it made my ears ring. We waited until morning, because night felt owned, claimed by something we did not understand, and when we finally followed Mark's path, it did not lead away from camp like Daniel's had. It curved back around us, looping close, passing within meters of where we slept, close enough that I could see disturbed frost where something heavy had stood and watched. We found Mark just before the ridge. What was left of him. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Just the unmistakable evidence of consumption, precise and methodical, as if hunger had been expressed with discipline instead of frenzy. The worst part was his face, frozen in an expression that was not fear, but recognition, like he had understood something too late and accepted it. That was when the word surfaced, not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a diagnosis. Wechuge. And we realized it was not hunting randomly. It was correcting us. After Mark, the word survival stopped meaning escape and started meaning delay, because whatever rules we thought still applied to the world had already been rewritten without our consent, and we were only just beginning to notice. We decided to move camp at first light, not because we believed it would save us, but because staying felt like agreement, like accepting that the clearing had been claimed and that remaining inside it would turn us from targets into fixtures. No one argued about direction, which should have been impossible given how stubborn we all were before. But now every suggestion felt equally wrong, and we chose east simply because it was the direction no one felt strongly about, as if avoiding intention might somehow make us less visible. Packing was quiet and rushed, hands numb not only from cold but from the growing sense that anything we left behind would not be there if we came back for it. As we walked, the forest shifted in ways I could not explain without sounding insane, distances stretching and compressing unpredictably, landmarks appearing closer than they should have been, then receding again, as if space itself was being adjusted in response to us. We stayed close, too close, boots nearly overlapping, because separation had become synonymous with disappearance. By midday, Claire started slowing down. She insisted she was fine, but her breathing was shallow and irregular, and every few minutes she would stop and tilt her head, listening to something the rest of us could not hear, her eyes tracking empty air like she was following a conversation happening just outside our range. When I asked her what was wrong, she said nothing was wrong, then repeated my name back to me slowly, like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. The hunger returned suddenly, violently, without warning. It was not the dull ache of missed meals, but a sharp, commanding sensation that pushed everything else aside. and I realized with growing horror that it was synchronized, hitting us all at once like a signal. We stopped to eat even though we had promised we would not, hands shaking as we tore open the last remaining packages, chewing too fast, swallowing without tasting, driven by something that felt imposed rather than internal. That was when Claire wandered off. She did not announce it. She did not panic. She simply drifted away while we were distracted by food, stepping sideways into the trees like someone stepping out of a crowded room. And by the time I noticed the gap where she had been standing, the forest had already closed behind her. We searched until our voices broke. We found nothing. But that night, long after we had stopped calling her name, I heard it spoken back to us from somewhere deep in the trees, stretched and distorted, like a sound being pushed through a throat that was not built for language. By the time the fourth death came, we understood that the Wechuge did not need proximity to kill us, only access, and access was something fear provided freely. There were 3 of us left now, moving like a single wounded animal through terrain that no longer felt neutral, every step weighed down by the knowledge that we were being reduced deliberately, not attacked impulsively. Sleep became impossible. When we closed our eyes, images surfaced uninvited, not memories but impressions, sensations of being observed from above, from below, from inside our own bodies. And more than once I woke with the certainty that something had been standing just beyond my vision, waiting for me to notice it so the waiting could end. Ethan was the one who broke next. He stopped speaking entirely sometime during the night, his silence so complete it felt intentional. And when I tried to engage him in the morning, he responded with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a nod that felt like dismissal. He began lagging behind, just enough to force us to choose between slowing down or leaving him alone, and every time we waited for him to catch up, I felt a pressure in my chest that told me we were making the wrong choice either way. That afternoon, snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, erasing our tracks almost as soon as we made them, and for the first time I understood how completely we could vanish here without effort or resistance. Visibility dropped, the world narrowing to a white tunnel, and when I turned to check on Ethan, he was no longer there. This time, we did not search. We stood in place, listening, because some instinct deeper than thought told us that movement would be an invitation. The forest was silent for a long time, long enough for hope to begin creeping back in, and then the sound came, unmistakable and close, the slow crack of bone under pressure, followed by a wet tearing noise that was careful, almost respectful. I do not know how long we stood there before the sound stopped. When we moved again, it was only because standing still had become unbearable, and as we walked, I realized with a clarity that made my stomach drop that the Wechuge was no longer removing us simply to feed. It was shaping the group, reducing it to the configuration it wanted, and for the first time, I wondered not who would be next, but why I was still alive. By the 5th day, survival no longer felt like movement forward, but like being held in place by something that understood exactly how much pressure we could take before breaking. There were only 2 of us left now, myself and Sarah, and the absence of the others had begun to feel physical, like missing teeth in a mouth that could no longer close properly. The forest felt wider with fewer people in it, every sound stretched thin, every shadow given more space to breathe. Sarah had stopped asking questions. She followed me closely, too closely at times, her boots landing almost on top of my own tracks, her breathing shallow and uneven, and I could feel her watching me when she thought I was not paying attention, studying my movements, my reactions, as if trying to determine something important. I wanted to tell her that whatever she was thinking, it was already too late, but the words would not come, because some part of me was afraid that speaking would accelerate whatever process had already begun. We found the remains of the survey camp just before dusk. It looked untouched from a distance, tents still standing, equipment neatly stacked, flags hanging limp in the cold air, and for a brief, dangerous moment, relief surged through me so strongly it made my knees weak. That feeling died the instant we stepped inside the perimeter and realized what was wrong. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no scattered gear, just absence, complete and orderly, like the people who had lived there had been removed carefully, one at a time, without resistance. Inside the main tent, we found plates set out for a meal that had never been eaten. The smell hit us immediately, rich and overwhelming, far too strong for the amount of food present, and my stomach twisted violently as hunger slammed into me with a force that nearly dropped me to the ground. Sarah reacted differently. She inhaled deeply, eyes closing, her expression softening into something that looked disturbingly like relief. She said it smelled right. That was when I realized the Wechuge was no longer simply removing us. It was changing us. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She paced the edge of the camp, muttering under her breath, stopping frequently to press her hand against her stomach as if listening from the inside. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me she felt lighter, clearer, like something heavy had been lifted from her. And when she smiled at me in the firelight, her teeth looked sharper than I remembered. I woke just before dawn to find her gone. This time there was no panic, only certainty. I did not follow her tracks because I already knew where they led. Being alone should have made me safer. That was the lie I told myself as I packed up what little remained, hands moving automatically while my mind lagged behind, struggling to accept that I was still breathing while everyone else had been reduced to silence. The forest felt different without other people in it, less reactive, less interested, like a predator settling in after a successful kill. The hunger eased. Not disappeared, but softened, retreating into something manageable, and that terrified me more than pain would have because it felt like approval. I moved south, then west, following terrain that should have led me out within a day. But time had begun to lose coherence, hours stretching unpredictably, daylight lingering too long or vanishing too fast, my body struggling to maintain rhythm in a place that rejected it. That was when I began to hear Sarah again. Not screaming, not calling for help, talking. Her voice drifted through the trees casually, conversationally, sometimes using my name, sometimes not, always just far enough away that I could not pinpoint its source. She spoke about hunger, about clarity, about how heavy it felt to be human before you learned how unnecessary most of it was. I knew better than to answer. I also knew it would not matter forever. That evening, as I crossed a frozen stream, I saw movement reflected in the ice beneath my feet, tall and elongated, pacing me perfectly, matching my speed without effort. I did not look up. I did not stop. I focused on placing one foot in front of the other while my reflection fractured and reformed around something that did not belong to me. When night fell, I felt it settle in. Not close, not distant, inside the space that used to feel like safety. I understood then why I had been spared, why I had been reduced last, why the hunger had softened instead of sharpened. I was not being hunted anymore. I was being prepared. The Wechuge did not want my body yet. It wanted my understanding first. By the 7th day, I stopped thinking in terms of escape and started thinking in terms of permission. Because the forest no longer reacted to my movement but to my hesitation, tightening whenever I tried to decide something too consciously, relaxing only when I surrendered to instinct. I realized this slowly, through repetition, through the way paths seemed to open only after I abandoned the idea of choosing them, and it terrified me to understand that whatever governed this place responded better to obedience than resistance. I slipped in fragments, never long enough to dream fully, but long enough to feel hands in my thoughts, rearranging memories with a delicacy that suggested intention rather than force. Faces from the team surfaced uninvited, not as they had been at the end, but as they were before we came here, healthy, joking, careless. And each time the image lingered too long, something inside me twisted sharply, like a reminder that nostalgia was a liability. The hunger returned that morning, but it was different now. It no longer felt aggressive or painful, but instructive. like a low pressure behind the ribs guiding my attention outward instead of inward, sharpening my senses in ways that felt wrong and intoxicating at the same time. I could smell things I should not have been able to identify: old ash buried under snow, distant water moving under ice, rot hidden beneath bark, and beneath it all, a deeper scent that felt personal, intimate, like breath on skin. That was when I realized I was no longer alone. Not because I saw anything, but because the forest began responding to me in real time. Branches shifting subtly as I passed, snow sliding from boughs seconds after I looked at them, sounds adjusting to my pace, never ahead, never behind, always beside. I spoke aloud without meaning to, testing whether my voice still belonged to me, and when my words were absorbed without echo, I understood that I was being listened to closely. I reached a clearing just before dusk, one I did not remember traveling toward, and in its center stood something that had not been there before. A structure. Not a cabin, not a shelter, but an arrangement, bones and wood and frozen sinew woven together in a way that suggested architecture learned secondhand, as if something had watched humans build and attempted to replicate the idea without fully understanding the purpose. I did not approach it at first. I stood at the edge of the clearing, hard hammering, waiting for fear to override curiosity. It never did. Instead, I felt a pull, gentle and persuasive, and I realized with a wave of nausea that this was the same sensation that must have guided Mark and Claire and Sarah, not force, not coercion, but the quiet relief of being shown where to go. Inside the structure, I found objects that did not belong together. Personal items from the team arranged carefully, boots aligned, gloves folded, photos smoothed flat, each placed with a precision that suggested respect rather than mockery. At the center lay something worse. A space left empty, not forgotten, not unfinished, but reserved. For me. I did not run when I understood what the empty space meant, because running requires the belief that distance still matters, and by then, I knew it did not. I stepped into the clearing fully, the cold biting into my skin with a sharpness that felt ceremonial, like crossing a threshold rather than entering danger. And the forest seemed to exhale collectively, branches settling, wind easing, as if a long-awaited alignment had finally been achieved. The Wechuge revealed itself without appearing. That is the only way I can describe it honestly. The pressure in the air shifted, gravity seeming to lean in my direction, and I became acutely aware of my own body as an object being evaluated, not for weakness, but for suitability. Images flooded my mind, not visions in the mystical sense, but impressions layered so densely they felt invasive, moments of hunger, of cold, of isolation so profound they erased identity, and beneath them all, a presence that endured by adapting rather than conquering. I understood then that slaughter was not the point. Correction was. The Wechuge did not remove people because it hated them, but because they represented imbalance, excess, inefficiency, and one by one, we had been measured against a standard we did not know existed. Daniel's calm had been wasteful. Mark's hunger had been premature. Claire's sensitivity had been misaligned. Sarah's acceptance had been incomplete. And me, I had lasted because I resisted without defiance, observed without interfering, survived without asserting dominance. And now the forest was asking the only question that mattered. Would I remain human if it no longer served a purpose? The hunger surged one final time, overwhelming and total, and for a moment I was certain this was the end, that my body would fail, that I would be consumed as the others had been, reduced to function and silence. Instead, it receded again, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like pain, and I realized I was being spared not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Witnesses are part of the process. I was guided out of the clearing without seeing how, led through terrain that unfolded effortlessly, and by dawn, I emerged at the edge of a logging road I did not remember approaching. The forest behind me was unremarkable, empty, silent, as if it had never been anything else. They asked me later what happened to the others. I told them what I could. I did not tell them everything, because some corrections are still ongoing, and some predators do not need to follow you out of the woods to finish their work. I did not feel relief when I reached the logging road, and that realization came as a shock in itself, because relief was the emotion I had been fantasizing about for days, imagining how it would feel to see something man-made, something ordinary, something that proved the forest had an edge. Instead, what I felt was displacement, like I had stepped out of a room in the middle of a conversation that was not finished, leaving behind something that still expected my response. The rescue was efficient, procedural, stripped of emotion in a way that felt almost obscene after what had happened. Questions were asked in the correct order, notes were taken, coordinates recorded, and I answered automatically, aware that every sentence I spoke was being flattened into data that could never hold what it needed to contain. They wrapped me in a thermal blanket, handed me water, and warned me not to drink too fast, and all the while I kept looking past them, over their shoulders, waiting for the forest to react. It did not. That should have comforted me. It did not. During the flight out, I became aware of a sensation I could not name at first, a subtle pressure behind my eyes, like I was being observed through memory rather than sight. When I closed my eyes, I did not see the Wechuge, but I felt its attention shift, not following me, not pursuing, but adjusting, like a hand lifting briefly from a surface before resting again somewhere else. They told me later that the search teams never found the others. No remains, no clear evidence of predation, no explanation that could survive scrutiny. Exposure was listed, disorientation, human error. The language of bureaucracy did what it always does, and sealed the story into something manageable, something that could be archived and forgotten. I tried to forget with it. The hunger followed me out, not as pain, not as craving, but as awareness, a low, constant hum that sharpened whenever I was alone or surrounded by people who spoke too loudly about things that did not matter. Food lost its comfort. Sleep lost its depth. I began waking just before dawn with the sensation that something had just finished listening. Months passed. Then patterns emerged. Animals avoided me without fear, veering away as if responding to pressure rather than threat. People confided in me without understanding why, telling me things they clearly had not planned to say, their voices dropping, their eyes unfocusing slightly, like something about me invited confession. I stopped interrupting them. I stopped reassuring them. I started recognizing the signs, the hunger, the isolation, the quiet corrections people made in their behavior without realizing why. I understood then that what happened in the forest had not ended. It had concluded one phase, and something else had begun. The realization that I had not been spared but repositioned arrived slowly, over years, through accumulation rather than revelation. I did not wake one morning knowing the truth. I noticed it in fragments, in the way certain places made my skin tighten, in the way prolonged solitude felt not empty but attentive, as if absence itself had weight. I returned to the north once, not to the same place, not intentionally. Work took me close enough that I felt the pressure begin to build again, that familiar sense of alignment, of something deep and patient recognizing a familiar configuration. I did not enter the forest. I did not need to. Standing at the edge was enough to feel the response ripple outward, subtle and controlled. I understood then that distance had never been the point. The Wechuge does not claim territory. It claims processes, hunger, isolation, correction. I had survived because I learned how it thinks, not because I defeated it, not because I escaped, but because I became useful. Witnesses shape narratives. Narratives shape behavior. Behavior determines who strays far enough, long enough to require intervention. I tell this story carefully, not to warn people away, because warnings rarely work, but to describe the pattern clearly enough that those who recognize themselves in it might pause, hesitate, adjust before the process completes. I do not describe the Wechuge as a monster, because monsters are external, and this is not. This is something that emerges where systems fail and hunger outpaces empathy. Sometimes, late at night, when the world feels particularly loud and meaningless, I feel the hunger sharpen briefly, like a signal testing a line that still exists. It never lasts. It never needs to. I am still here. That was the agreement. The others were slaughtered one by one because they fit too cleanly into roles that could be removed without consequence. I was left because I blurred those lines, because I observed without consuming, because I adapted without committing fully. That balance is fragile. I maintain it by speaking, by recording, by refusing to let the story collapse into silence where it can evolve unchecked. This is not confession. This is maintenance. If you are listening to this and something about it feels uncomfortably precise, if the idea of hunger as guidance resonates in a way you cannot explain, then understand this clearly. The Wechuge does not need to find you. It only needs you to be ready. And when it does begin correcting again, it will not announce itself. It will simply start removing what no longer fits, one by one. If you made it this far, then you understand why this story was never written into an official report. Because reports need clean edges, and what happened to us did not have any. They will tell you it was weather. They will tell you it was panic. They will tell you we made mistakes and nature did the rest. That version is easier to live with because it keeps the horror outside the human mind and safely inside the wilderness. But I am the last one, and I am telling you the truth. The Wechuge did not slaughter us because it was wild or angry or desperate. It slaughtered us because it was patient enough to watch us become predictable, hungry enough to recognize what each of us would sacrifice first, and intelligent enough to use our own instincts to separate us without forcing anything. That is why the others went one by one, and that is why I was saved for last, not as mercy, but as function, because something about being the final witness completes the pattern. So here is what I want you to do now. If you have ever felt that certain places get quieter when you arrive, if you have ever noticed hunger shifting from your stomach to your thoughts, if you have ever woken up with the sensation that something was listening and you could not prove it, then do not ignore that. Put it in the comments without explaining it. Just a simple line that tells me you recognize the pattern. And if you have a story that feels too strange to say out loud, send it to the channel, because the only way these things keep growing is when people stay silent. Like the video, because the more people this reaches, the harder it is for the truth to be filed away and forgotten. Subscribe, because this channel is where the sealed stories go when the official versions stop making sense. And share this with someone who thinks the worst predators always chase, because some of them do not chase at all. They wait. And when they start correcting again, they will not come from the trees first. They will come from the hunger, one by one.